The radio in her headset crackled with the sound of men about to die. It was a specific, desperate frequency, a mix of controlled breathing, the staccato percussion of rifle fire in the background, and a voice strained under the immense weight of impending death. Captain Eva Reaper Rostova's knuckles tightened on the control stick of her A-10 Thunderbolt, her aircraft suspended in a turbulent pre-dawn darkness over the Hindu Kush. The voice, call sign Valkyrie Actual, was sharp but fraying at the edges. "Reaper, this is Valkyrie Actual. We are dry on ammo and they are in the open. Request immediate KS, over." Ava's eyes, a cool and focused gray, flicked from her targeting display to the weathered photograph wedged next to her altimeter. It was a black and white image of a young man, her brother Alexei, his Marine Corps dress uniform looking too big for his 18-year-old frame. That photo was her compass, her reminder. It was the reason the voice on the radio wasn't just a call sign. It was a person with a family, with a story not yet finished. Valkyrie Actual, Reaper copies. "I am on station. Painting your location now," she responded, her own voice a calm, mechanical contrast to the chaos below. Her fingers danced across the console, programming the coordinates. The terrain-following radar painted a brutal picture, a narrow ridgeline at 7,000 feet. Her team trapped in a shallow depression, enemy heat signatures swarming the high ground like fire ants. Then, another voice cut through the channel, cold and absolute. It was Mission Command at Bagram. "Reaper 1-1, abort mission. I repeat, abort. Satellite and drone feed confirm a severe haboob has entered the valley. You are looking at zero visibility below 5,000 feet. Return to base immediately." Eva's stomach tightened into a cold knot. She peered through her canopy. Ahead, the valley was swallowed by a moving wall of brown, a dust storm of biblical proportions. Flying into that meant instrument failure, disorientation, and a fiery impact against a mountainside. "It was a suicide run. Command, Reaper, understand the weather." "The situation on the ground is critical. Valkyrie will be overrun in minutes," she argued, her gaze locked on the targeting screen, on the blinking icon that represented 4 lives. "The decision is not negotiable. Reaper 1-1, your risk exceeds the tactical gain. Turn back now. That is a direct order." The finality in the controller's voice was like a slamming door. In that suspended moment, the world narrowed to the sounds in her headset, the roar of her twin turbofan engines, the howl of the wind, and then, faint but clear from Valkyrie's open mic, a new sound, the distinct guttural chant of the enemy closing in for the final assault. It was the sound of a trap springing shut. She saw her brother's face in her mind, not from the photo, but from a story he'd told her. He'd described being pinned down in a Ramadi alleyway, certain he was going to die, until the unforgettable roar of an A-10 descended from the clouds. "It was like the sky itself tore apart to save us, Eva," he'd said, his eyes wide with the memory. The pilot of that plane had broken the rules too. The SEALs on the ridge weren't just assets. They were someone's brothers, someone's sons. They were Alexei. The debt she owed to that unknown pilot who saved her brother was a chain linking her to every soldier on the ground. Orders were written by men in safe rooms, but honor was written in the skies above the fight. Reaper 1-1 acknowledged the order. "Confirm you are returning to base." Eva took a deep, shuddering breath, her hand gripping the throttle. She made her choice. She pushed the stick forward, nosing the heavy aircraft down, aiming its titanium bathtub cockpit directly into the heart of the raging brown storm. "Valkyrie Actual," she said, her voice steady as stone. "This is Reaper. I am inbound. Talk me on." The storm swallowed her whole. The world dissolved into a churning, violent brown. One moment, Eva was in a clear, star-dusted sky, and the next, her A-10 was swallowed by the haboob. Grit and sand scoured her canopy, reducing visibility to 0. The aircraft bucked and shuddered, a toy in the hands of a giant. Warning lights flickered on her panel, proximity alerts, wind shear. The ridge was down there, somewhere, a jagged spine of rock waiting to tear her wings off. She was flying on instruments alone, her eyes glued to the artificial horizon, her hands making constant tiny corrections against the buffeting wind. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the roar of the storm. This was madness. This was how pilots vanished, their names added to a list with the simple notation, weather-related incident. Senior Chief Miller pressed himself into the cold. Hard earth, the sharp rocks digging into his chest. The dust storm had reached them now, a blessing and a curse. It reduced the enemy's visibility, but it also meant any hope of air support was gone. The chanting was closer now. He could hear individual voices, taunting, confident. He glanced at his team. Davis had a bloody bandage around his thigh, his face pale. Jenkins was down to his pistol, methodically placing his last few rounds. They were out of options, out of time. The final stand. He thought of his wife's face, the smell of her perfume, a world away from this God-forsaken ridge. The memory was a sharp, painful sweetness. Then a sound cut through the howling wind and gunfire, a low, distant rumble that was entirely out of place. It was a sound he'd prayed for but had given up on hearing. The deep, throaty growl of twin turbofan engines. Ava fought the stick, muscles screaming. Her altimeter spun crazily. She was flying nap of the earth, so low that the terrain warning system was a constant panicked beep in her headset. She had to get below the storm's thickest layer, had to find a seam of clear air. Valkyrie, Reaper, do you have eyes on me? I have no visual. Static. Then a broken transmission. Negative, Reaper. Only hear you. Storm is complete. The signal was being swallowed by the mountain and the dust. She was blind. The mission commander's voice was a ghost in her ear, a final angry warning. Reaper, you have violated a direct order. Turn back now. She reached up and silenced the channel. There was no going back. Only through. Miller craned his neck, squinting into the brown gloom. The roaring was getting louder, tearing the very fabric of the storm apart. It was coming from the east, screaming down the valley. Then, for a split second, the dust parted like a curtain. A shape, dark and monstrous, emerged from the wall of dirt. It was so low he could see the details of its gray camouflage, the blunt nose, the engines mounted high on the fuselage. It was the most beautiful, terrifying thing he had ever seen. She's here! He yelled over the din, a surge of raw, unbelievable hope flooding his veins. The Warthog is here! Eva saw it, too. A momentary window in the chaos. The ridge. The swarming heat signatures of the enemy on her scopes. And the 4 isolated friendly icons, pinned and helpless. It was a pilot's nightmare scenario. A steep ridge, a high enemy position, and her allies dangerously, impossibly close. A danger-close run that would be rejected in any simulation. There was no time for a second pass. No room for error. Her thumb hovered over the weapon select switch, moving from the guided missiles to the one weapon built for this hell, the GAU-8 Avenger cannon. Valkyrie actual, she said, her voice eerily calm, the eye of her own personal hurricane. I have visual. I see the situation. I am making my gun run. Keep your heads down. She took a final, steadying breath, lined up the pipper on her heads-up display, and began her attack dive. The A-10 seemed to hang in the air for a moment, a predator sizing up its prey. Then the nose dipped, and the aircraft screamed down the valley. A gray arrow aimed at the heart of the enemy position. Inside the cockpit, Eva's world narrowed to the glowing crosshairs on her heads-up display. The ridge swelled in her vision, a jagged line of rock and death. The targeting computer calculated the trajectory, the wind shear, the angle of attack. It was a brutal, mathematical ballet. She could hear Senior Chief Miller's voice, calm and precise, a rock in the storm of her focus. Enemy massed on the reverse slope, Reaper. They're in a trench line 50 meters from our position. You are cleared hot. The words danger close hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone on the frequency. It meant her margin for error was 0. A single miscalculation and her 30-millimeter rounds would tear through friend and foe alike. On the ground, the world dissolved into a primal sensory overload. Miller shoved Davis down behind the largest rock they could find, yelling at Jenkins to get low. There was no more cover to seek. This was it. They pressed their bodies into the dirt, making themselves as small as possible. The roar of the A-10's engines was no longer a distant promise. It was an all-consuming earthquake of sound that vibrated through the rock and into their bones. It was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard, a physical pressure threatening to rupture their eardrums. Miller risked a glance upward. The aircraft was terrifyingly close, filling his entire field of vision. He could see the individual panels on its wings, the grim shark-like mouth painted near the nose. For a heart-stopping second, he locked eyes with the dark visor of the pilot's helmet. It was just a flash, but it was a connection. A human connection in the midst of the mechanical fury. Eva's thumb found the red pickle button on her control stick. Her index finger rested on the trigger for the GAU-8. The pipper settled over the enemy trench line. She saw them now, not as heat signatures, but as figures scrambling, looking up at the approaching fury. There was no hatred in her heart, no rage. There was only the problem. The problem was the trench line. The solution was the gun. She took one last half-second to confirm the alignment. It was perfect. She squeezed the trigger. The sound was not a gunshot. It was the sky being torn in half. The brrrr-t was a sustained, deafening roar of pure, unadulterated power. 500 rounds ripped from the 7-barrel cannon in a single, horrifying second. A stream of depleted uranium shells, each the size of a bottle, hosed down the reverse slope of the ridge. From the ground, it looked like the hand of God had reached down and smeared the mountain. The earth erupted in a continuous line of fire and dirt and pulverized rock. The enemy trench line vanished, replaced by a geyser of destruction that marched with methodical precision along the ridge. The concussive blast waves hit the SEALs like physical blows, pounding the air from their lungs. They kept their faces pressed into the dirt, feeling the shrapnel and debris rain down around them. The world had ended, and the A-10 was its architect. As quickly as it began, it stopped. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise. The brrrr-t was gone, replaced by the receding thunder of the A-10's engines as Eva pulled up, her wings banking sharply to avoid the climbing debris cloud. The dust began to slowly settle. Miller lifted his head, his ears ringing, his body trembling with adrenaline and relief. He looked toward the enemy position. Where there had been a trench, there was now a deep, smoking scar in the earth. The chanting, the gunfire, the movement, it was all gone. Utterly, completely gone. The ridge was silent save for the moaning of the wind. He keyed his radio, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper, the professional composure shattered by the sheer magnitude of what he had just witnessed. Reaper. Target destroyed. The ridge? It's gone. You blew it apart. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Acrid smoke and dust hung in the air, a gritty fog that stung the eyes and coated the throat. Senior Chief Miller slowly pushed himself to his knees, his body aching in protest. He looked at his team. Davis was staring wide-eyed at the smoldering scar that had been the enemy position, his mouth slightly agape. Jenkins was already on his feet, rifle up, scanning the devastation with a soldier's ingrained caution, but the fight was clearly over. There was nothing left to fight. Miller keyed his radio, his voice rough with swallowed dust and unshed emotion. Reaper. Target destroyed. The ridge? It's gone. You blew it apart. High above, Eva completed her climbing turn, the G-force pressing her back into her seat. She looked down at her handiwork. The tactical display showed the enemy heat signatures had vanished, wiped clean. Through a break in the lingering dust, she saw the blackened, churned earth where the trench line had been. There was no triumph in the sight, only a cold, hollow feeling in her gut. It was a necessary evil, a brutal calculus of war. 4 lives for 30. She had done the math. Copy that, Valkyrie. Area is secure. Her voice was flat, robotic, the adrenaline drain leaving her numb. I am at bingo fuel. Returning to base. She didn't wait for a response. She switched her radio to the Bagram Tower frequency, her mind already shifting to the next battle, the one waiting for her on the ground. The flight back was a silent, lonely vigil. The haboob had passed, and the dawn was now breaking, painting the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush in soft hues of orange and pink. It was a beautiful, peaceful sight that stood in stark contrast to the violence she had just unleashed. Her mind replayed the gun run in slow, meticulous detail. The alignment, the trigger squeeze, the devastating result. Had she been a fraction of a degree off, a single one of her rounds could have strayed. The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. She saw the photo of her brother. She had done for those SEALs what that unknown pilot had done for Alexei. The circle was complete. But the cost of closing that circle was a weight she would carry forever. The wheels of her A-10 screeched as they touched down on the Bagram runway. She guided the massive aircraft to its hard stand, the ground crew already moving in with chocks and ladders. As she shut down the engines, the sudden quiet was deafening. She unstrapped her helmet, her hands trembling slightly now that the mission was over. She opened the canopy and the cool morning air washed over her, carrying the familiar smells of jet fuel and dust. Climbing down the ladder, her legs felt weak. A crew chief gave her a thumbs up, a look of awe on his young face. But Ava's eyes were fixed ahead. Parked near the hangar was a black sedan, and standing beside it, his arms crossed and his face a mask of grim disapproval, was her mission commander, Colonel Jansen. Next to him stood a stern-looking man in a crisp uniform she didn't recognize, likely from JAG. She walked toward them, her flight suit stained with sweat, her body aching with fatigue. She stopped a few feet away and rendered a crisp salute. Colonel Jansen returned the salute slowly, his eyes boring into hers. "Captain Rostova," he began, his voice dangerously quiet. "You directly disobeyed a lawful order in a combat zone. You risked a multi-million-dollar asset and your own life on a mission that was, by all tactical assessments, a guaranteed loss." He gestured to the man beside him. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Briggs from the Judge Advocate General's Corps. We will be conducting a preliminary inquiry into your actions today. You are to consider yourself grounded, effective immediately, pending the outcome of this investigation." Eva stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on a point just past the colonel's shoulder. She had known this was coming. The debt was paid. Whatever came next, she would face it. The recognition she cared about was the one she had already received in a broken whisper over the radio from a ridge in Kunar. The silence in the debriefing room was colder than the thin metal chair Eva sat on. It was a sterile, windowless box, the air smelling of stale coffee and antiseptic cleaner. Across the gray table, Colonel Jansen and Lieutenant Colonel Briggs formed a wall of grim authority. A digital recorder sat between them, its tiny red light a glaring, accusatory eye. "Captain Rostova," Briggs began, his voice devoid of any inflection. "Let's start from the beginning. You received a direct order from Mission Command to abort and return to base. Is that correct?" Ava kept her posture ramrod straight, her hands folded on the table. "Yes, sir." "And you acknowledge that you deliberately violated that order?" "I determined the tactical situation on the ground had reached a critical threshold." "Sir," Jansen leaned forward, his knuckles white on the table. "Don't quote regulation at us, Captain. You're a pilot, not a ground commander. Your determination was in direct contradiction to real-time satellite intelligence and the judgment of your commanding officer. You flew into a known haboob. You could have been killed, and we would have lost a valuable aircraft for nothing." Ava met his gaze. "With all due respect, sir, it wasn't for nothing." She could still hear the chanting over the open mic, a sound that would haunt her dreams. Briggs made a note on a legal pad. "The preliminary after-action report from the SEAL team confirms the enemy was neutralized. However, that success does not absolve the act of insubordination. The military functions on a chain of command for a reason, Captain. Your actions, however well-intentioned, undermine that foundation." He slid a grainy black-and-white photograph from a folder. It was a drone image of the ridge after her strike. The trench line was a raw, dark gash. "This is the result of your determination. A 30-meter-long scar. The JAG office will be determining if this constitutes excessive use of force." Eva's composure finally cracked, a flicker of anger in her eyes. "Excessive force, sir. They were about to overrun a four-man team. It was a 30-second window. The GIU-8 was the only weapon for the job. It was that or let them die." She thought of the photo in her cockpit. "I made a choice." Jansen's voice was low. "A choice that may very well end your career." The door to the debriefing room opened with a soft click. All three of them turned. Standing in the doorway was Senior Chief Miller. He had clearly come straight from the medevac chopper. His combat fatigues were torn and stained with dirt and dried blood. A fresh bandage was wrapped around his bicep, and his face was a landscape of cuts and bruises. But his eyes were clear and held a terrifying intensity. He ignored the colonels for a moment, his gaze finding Ava. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned to the table. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice rough from dust and smoke, "I need a moment." Briggs was flustered. "Senior Chief, this is a closed JAG inquiry. You can give your official statement later." "With respect, sir," Miller said, not moving from the doorway, "my statement won't wait." He walked into the room, his movements stiff with fatigue, and came to stand beside Ava's chair. He looked at the photograph of the scarred ridge. "I was there. Captain Rostova didn't just save our lives. She executed the most precise, most courageous piece of flying I have ever witnessed in 15 years of doing this job. We were seconds from being overrun. The enemy was close enough for me to smell them. There was no excessive force. There was only the necessary force. The only force that could have saved us." He placed his hands on the table, leaning towards the two officers. "She was told it was impossible. She was told to turn back. But she flew into a dust storm that grounded every other asset we had. She found us. She made the shot that no one else would have dared to make." He straightened up, his jaw set. Then, with a deliberate, slow movement, he unpinned the gold trident emblem from the collar of his filthy uniform, the Navy SEAL insignia. He placed it on the table in front of Ava. It landed with a soft, final click. "That," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain, "belongs to her more than it does to me. She earned it." The room fell into a silence even deeper than before. The red light on the recorder seemed to blink in shock. Colonel Jansen stared at the trident, then at Miller's resolute face, and finally at Eva. The anger in his eyes had been replaced by something far more complex. A dawning, grudging understanding of a debt that existed outside of regulations. The case against Captain Eva Rostova, in that moment, crumbled to dust. The silence in the room was now a living thing, heavy with the weight of the gold trident lying on the gray table. Lieutenant Colonel Briggs looked from the emblem to Senior Chief Miller's battered face, his legal arguments dissolving in the face of raw, unassailable testimony. Colonel Jansen's stern expression had fractured completely. He was a commander, and he understood the language of sacrifice and honor better than the language of legal procedure. He slowly reached out and turned off the digital recorder, the little red light dying with a soft click. "Senior Chief," Jansen said, his voice considerably quieter, "your team is cleared for debriefing with medical. You should be with them." It wasn't a dismissal, but an acknowledgement. Miller gave one last, long look at Ava, a look that conveyed a universe of gratitude and respect, and then he turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The door closed, leaving Ava alone with the two senior officers. Briggs gathered his papers, the photograph of the ridge now seeming irrelevant. "The preliminary inquiry is concluded, Captain Rostova," he said stiffly. "No further action will be taken by this office." He stood and left without another word. Jansen remained seated, staring at the trident. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "I am grounding you for 72 hours, Captain, for exhaustion and post-mission stress, not as a punishment. After that, your aircraft will be waiting." He stood up, pausing at the door. "What you did, it was the wrong decision, but it was the right thing to do. Don't make a habit of it." And then she was alone. The official storm had passed. She looked down at the sealed trident. It felt impossibly heavy. She didn't pick it up. It wasn't hers to keep. It was a message, one she understood perfectly. She stood, her body feeling 1,000 years old, and walked out of the room. The sun was fully risen now, casting long, sharp shadows across the tarmac. The air was still cool, but it carried the promise of the day's heat. Ava walked away from the command buildings, needing space, needing to breathe air that wasn't recycled and tense. She found a quiet spot near a chain-link fence overlooking the perimeter. In the distance, the mountains where she had almost died, where she had killed, stood impassive and eternal. The numbness was receding, replaced by a tremor that started deep in her soul and threatened to shake her apart. She had faced court-martial and won. She had been called a hero. So why did she feel so shattered? A single silent tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. She didn't sob. She just stood there, allowing the quiet release of a pressure that had been building since she first heard Valkyrie's desperate call. Later, after a shower that felt like it would never wash away the grit, and a few hours of fitful sleep, she found herself in the squadron's ready room. It was empty. Her gaze fell on the photo of her brother, which she had retrieved from her cockpit, his smiling, youthful face. She had spent her entire career trying to repay a debt to a ghost, to the unknown pilot who had given her back her brother. Today she had finally become that ghost for someone else. The circle was not just complete. It had been redeemed. She hadn't just saved 4 men. She had validated the sacrifice of that long-ago pilot. She had proven that the bond between the sky and the ground was unbreakable, a sacred trust that sometimes demanded breaking the rules. A sense of peace, fragile but real, began to settle over her. The tremor in her hands stilled. As dusk began to settle over Bagram, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, a young airman found her. "Captain Rostova, this came for you through secure channels." He handed her a single sheet of paper. It was a plain text printout, no header, no signature. Only one line of text. She read it, and a small, weary but genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her pocket alongside the photo of her brother. She walked out of the ready room and looked up at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. The war was still there. The mountains still held their dangers. But for now, her part was done. The debt was paid. The message in her pocket was all the recognition she would ever need. It was from an unknown number, and it read simply, "The debt is paid. Valkyrie." The 72 hours of enforced rest felt like a sentence of its own. The frantic energy of the mission had drained away, leaving behind a hollowed-out quiet. Ava moved through the routines of the base like a ghost, the echoes of the GAU-8's roar a constant tinnitus in her mind. She ate in the mess hall without tasting the food, the boisterous chatter of other pilots feeling a million miles away. She walked the perimeter fence, her eyes always drifting back to the mountains, now serene and beautiful in the distance, hiding their brutal secrets. Sleep was fractured, filled with dreams of brownouts and chanting voices, and the terrified, hopeful eyes of Senior Chief Miller looking up from the ridge. She would wake with a start, her heart pounding, the phantom smell of cordite and dust in her nostrils. The official vindication meant nothing against the visceral memory of killing. She had saved lives, but she had taken them, and the ledger of her soul felt painfully unbalanced. On the morning of the 3rd day, she was summoned to Colonel Jansen's office. She walked in, bracing for a final, formal reprimand, the ghost of the JAG inquiry still lingering. But the colonel's demeanor was different. The anger was gone, replaced by a weary professional respect. "Sit down, Captain," he said, gesturing to a chair. He didn't sit behind his desk, but leaned against it, facing her. "The after-action reports are finalized. The drone footage has been analyzed. Your gun run. It was textbook. Under those conditions, it was a 1 in a million shot." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I commanded a helicopter squadron in the First Gulf War. I know what it's like to have voices on the radio depending on you, and I know what it's like to have command telling you to turn back. It's a hell of a place to be." He looked at her, his gaze direct. "I still maintain you were wrong to disobey the order, but I cannot deny the result. You have the instincts of a true combat pilot, the kind we can't afford to lose." He handed her a set of flight orders. "Your grounding is lifted. You're back on the schedule, effective 0600 tomorrow." The weight on Eva's shoulders lightened, just a fraction. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was reinstatement. It was a return to her purpose. She left his office and went straight to the hangar. Her A-10 sat there, its dark gray skin still bearing the fine scratches from its journey through the haboob. The ground crew had refueled and rearmed it. The massive GAU-8 cannon was loaded, ready for the next call. She walked around the aircraft, her hand resting on its warm, sun-baked metal flank. It was no longer just a machine, a tool. It was a part of her now, a partner in the terrible, necessary dance she had performed over that ridge. The sight of it, ready to fly, was a balm to her restless spirit. That evening, she sat alone on her bunk, the folded note and her brother's photograph on the small table beside her. She read the words again. "The debt is paid, Valkyrie." It was the only medal she wanted. It was a message from the ground, from the men whose boots were in the dirt, and in their world, her actions were not just justified, they were heroic. She thought of Senior Chief Miller placing his trident on the table. It wasn't a gift to be worn. It was a testament, a silent understanding passed between warriors. She picked up the photo of her brother. His smile no longer seemed like a challenge from the past, a debt to be repaid. It now felt like an affirmation. She had stepped into the story he had told her, and she had written her own chapter. The circle was no longer just about debt. It was about legacy. It was about the unbroken chain of soldiers and airmen who looked out for one another regardless of the cost. A profound calm settled over her. The tremor was gone. The ghosts were quiet. She was Captain Eva Reaper Rostova, a pilot of the A-10 Thunderbolt II, and she was ready to fly again. The pre-dawn air of Bagram was a familiar blanket, cool and smelling of dust and jet fuel. For the first time in 72 hours, Eva felt a sense of rightness settle deep in her bones. The ritual was the same. The walk to the hangar, the low, predatory silhouette of her A-10 waiting in the half-light, the quiet exchange of nods with the ground crew. But something was different. She was different. As she climbed the ladder and slid into the cockpit, the worn leather of the seat felt like a homecoming. She ran her hands over the familiar switches and dials, her gaze lingering for a moment on the empty spot where her brother's photo had been. She had moved it, tucking it safely into her personal effects. It no longer needed to be a reminder of a debt. Its lesson was now a part of her, etched as permanently as the serial number on the aircraft's frame. Her mission today was a simple combat air patrol, a routine overwatch for a coalition supply convoy moving through a relatively peaceful valley. It was the kind of mission that was 99% boredom, a world away from the desperate intensity of the Kunar Ridge. Yet as she fired up the twin turbofan engines and felt the deep, resonant power thrum through the airframe, she felt a focused calm, not the jittery anticipation of before. She was no longer just a pilot flying a machine. She was a guardian, a promise of salvation held in the sky. The control tower cleared her for takeoff. Reaper 1-1, wind is calm. You are cleared for runway 09er. Good hunting. She pushed the throttles forward. The engines roaring in response, and the A-10 surged down the runway, eager for the sky. As she climbed above the airfield, the sun broke over the eastern peaks, flooding the cockpit with golden light. The world below was sharp and clear, the harsh beauty of Afghanistan laid out like a map. She checked in with the JTAC overseeing the convoy. Kodiak Actual, this is Reaper 1-1 on station and holding at Angels 15. The voice that came back was young, professional. Copy that, Reaper 1-1. Convoy is proceeding without incident. Enjoy the quiet. She leveled off, beginning a wide, lazy orbit over the snaking line of vehicles below. The silence in her headset was a gift. There were no desperate cries, no storm winds howling, no conflicting orders. There was only the hum of her systems and the vast open sky. Her mind drifted back to the note, now folded and secure in her pocket. The debt is paid. It was true. The debt to her brother's memory, the debt to the unknown pilot, had been settled in fire and blood and courage on that ridge. But she realized now that the work itself was not a debt. It was a privilege. It was a sacred trust, passed from one generation of guardians to the next. She looked down at the tiny, vulnerable-looking trucks on the road. The men and women in those vehicles would go home to their families because she was up here, watching. That was the real recognition. Not a medal, not a promotion, but the profound knowledge that she held a line against the chaos. Hours passed. The convoy reached its destination without a single shot being fired. Her fuel state dipped towards bingo. Kodiak Actual, Reaper 1-1 is Winchester on fuel. Proceeding to exit the station. Copy, Reaper. Quiet shift is the best shift. Thanks for the overwatch. As she turned her aircraft back towards Bagram, a new voice, faint and laced with static, broke into her assigned frequency. It was a voice she would know anywhere, calm and weathered by command. "Reaper 1-1, this is Valkyrie Actual on a private channel. Do you copy?" Ava's breath caught in her throat. "I copy, Valkyrie Actual." There was a pause, filled only with the hiss of the ether. "We're wheels up in 10. Heading home." Another pause. "Just wanted you to know, we're all going home, because of you." The transmission cut out. Ava stared out at the endless blue sky, a single clear tear tracing a path down her cheek. This was it. This was the end of the story. Not with a dramatic ceremony, but with a quiet transmission and the simple, profound truth that soldiers were going home to their families. She had flown into a storm and blown a ridge apart, but in doing so, she had forged something unbreakable. Captain Eva Reaper Rostova pushed the stick forward, pointing the nose of her warthog towards home, her watch complete.